So hi everyone. Today I want to introduce you to Kali. So Kali is deeply annoyed by the data-hungry software as a service providers. So Kali sets out on a quest to run their own server to provide the services they want or need in their own fashion. So this is actually easier said than done because Kali does not have the background in IT to do this. So this makes it super challenging to decide which infrastructure to use, how to configure, maintain, and secure the system. So in prior work, we talked to many people just like Kali. We investigated the challenges these so-called self-hosters face when administrating their own servers, and also what motivates them to do this. So we found that privacy is actually a major motivating factor for them. But we also learned that self-hosters have severe problems when it comes to securing their infrastructure. So currently, there is lack of comprehensive data on the scale of self-hosting. So what we want to do in this work is we want to find out how many people are self-hosting out there and also what makes them unique. So talking about research questions, as I said, we want to estimate the prevalence of self-hosting. So I think it's just in general a very interesting question. And it's the first step towards also understanding its security and privacy impact. And also the reviewers from the last paper said it's not really a big thing. So I also wanted to get the data on that. So we focus on the tools that people are hosting. And this is basically the major way of how we find out who is a self-hoster and who isn't. And this is also a plus because we get to learn about all the different technologies and server types that people are using. And also we focus on who these people actually are, so what makes them unique as compared to the general population. And by doing this, we find out more about constraining individual characteristics that can be relevant to system administration work. And this also might hint at roadblocks that we find in the hosting ecosystem. So moving on, I'd like to give a brief definition of what we consider self-hosting in this work. So we want the self-hoster to have control over the machine, and by machine, I mean it could be a server that they have sitting in their home, for example, a Raspberry Pi or something like this, but they can also rent out infrastructure from a hosting provider, so VPS would be just as fine. They have to have control over the software, so the operating system and also the services that they are hosting. The service should be available over network, and it's very important that they assume responsibility for the services they are hosting. So they are supposed to set them up themselves, to maintain them, to update, things like that. So speaking about how we did this, there's actually not that much data on self-hosting out there. So we started with a literature review to find out, what actually is the scope of this work, and can we find some initial themes maybe that we can rely on for the survey construction. So there was not that much work out there, which led us to also do focus groups with both self-hosters with a technical background, but also people who do not self-host and do not have a technical background. So then we were able to explore themes that people correlate or think are associated with self-hosting. And based off of those two steps, we formed a hypothesis that we then could look out for regarding the individual characteristics associated with self-hosting behavior. So then we went on to construct the surveys, and that actually took us a long time. So we took about, I think, a year until we had a survey instrument which we thought is good enough to actually measure this. Because if you think about it, it's not that easy because self-hosting, there was not much data on this, and we cannot really say, who would be connecting their services to the internet, for example, and who would not be, because it can be inherently off the grid, so it's hard to measure, with a network scan or internet scan. So this is why we relied on self-reported data in online surveys. So to estimate the prevalence, we did a representative study. And we want to identify the self-hosters. And then that's the first part. And then the second part is we match the self-hosters against the demographically matched control group. And then we can compare, how they scale on different metrics that we think might be correlated to self-hosting. I will talk about this in a second. So the first survey was with 1,500 participants. And as I said, the goal was to estimate the prevalence of private self-hosting. So we did this as I said, with a representative sample of the US population, which we obtain from Prolific. And in our case, representativeness is with regard to age, sex, and ethnicity. So we match the census data that's available. It's kind of difficult to do because if you think about it, you cannot just ask people, are you a self-hoster? Because the people who do this, they kind of will know probably what this is, but you will have a very high false positive rate because other people just don't know, what the concept is. So we framed the survey about software and application use. So we actually looked across 5 different use cases. We selected them also both based on the literature review and the focus groups we did beforehand. So we looked at file storage, websites, communication, synchronized password managing, and smart home. So just to give you an example, so this was what the participants saw as one part of the survey. So the survey is super complex. I just can only give you like a glimpse of what this is like. Refer to the paper and the appendix. Like everything is open access, so you can have a look at it. So here you can see people were selecting which tools they used privately and in a work context. And we had the most prominent proprietary tools here, but also tools that you are able to self-host. So people basically would just say, I'm using this, I'm using that. And then if they ticked a self-hostable tool, we would ask additional questions about server types and so on. So regarding the findings, so if a participant selected or added at least one self-hostable tool in one of the use case categories and indicated that they had set it up themselves on a server and confirmed that they had come into contact with self-hosting prior to the service, so this was like a sanity check that came after they had selected all of the tools, then we would identify them as a self-hoster. And if you can calculate it up, we ended up with an estimate of an upper bound of 8.4% self-hosters in the US, which I think is quite a lot. Then you can also compare self-hosters to people who are not self-hosting with regard to demographical data. So what we found is that self-hosters are statistically more likely to fall in the age group of 48 to 58 and be a man. And self-hosters are statistically less likely to be older than 58 years or be a woman or non-binary. Moving on, I'd like to just give you a glimpse of the tools that were frequently used for self-hosting. So actually, website hosting is the most frequent use case. So almost half, like a little bit more than half of the people who are self-hosting hosted a website. And 46% of self-hosters host WordPress websites, and those are running on home servers in half of the cases. All other use cases were equally distributed in terms of frequency. And just to pick one example here from the smart home use case, Home Assistant was the most frequent tool, and 25% of people had it accessible via the internet, so which could be a potentially security critical use case. So the second survey, there was then the goal to understand enabling and constraining individual characteristics that are relevant to system administration work. And we did this by comparing the self-hosters that we identified in the first survey to a demographically matched control group. So we had a second survey where basically we invited people to participate. And we checked for core themes that we think are associated with self-hosting based on prior work in the focus group. So it would be security, privacy, technology interests and skills, openness to new things, tinkering and DIY, money, work effort and control. And for those themes, we found scale measures in the literature that are being validated and established. I'm not going over all of them, but it's just an overview. And then people basically had to fill in these scales, and then we could compare, which factors are associated to self-hosting and which aren't. And if you do the math, like we ran a regression analysis, you can see actually that security and privacy are not associated with self-hosting, but the technology interests and skills is positively correlated. Tinkering and DIY, like people self-identifying as a maker, is positively correlated, and work effort, so grit, was actually negatively correlated, which was interesting to me. So now you could say, okay, this is awkward because, like, didn't you say in the beginning that people are motivated by privacy? Like, why is it not a theme here? So this is actually, you have to put it in perspective because privacy can still be a motivating factor for people to self-host, but it's just saying that, self-hosters as a population are not more privacy aware than the US population in general. So that's how to put it into perspective. Okay, so summing up. In my opinion, self-hosting is not a niche phenomenon based on our data. So we had identified prevalent and potentially high-risk use cases, and self-hosting requires a strong technical background. And then you could say, okay, but maybe that's not so surprising because obviously people who self-host have to have the strong technical background. But if you think about this, this could also be hinting at major roadblocks in the hosting ecosystem. That's basically then a survivorship bias, like causing a survivorship bias so that only people who have these skills can stay as self-hosters. So, if you get rid of them, maybe potentially more people would do it. Thank you.